Welcome to our Ministry Design Training webinar today. Discovering your core values is the topic that we're going to cover. It is a part of your ministry design process. We want you to understand at the outset that we have broken the ministry design process as you become the architect of your ministry design, that we've broken it into 4 phases, each having one or more steps that you'll take in order to develop how you do ministry, where you do ministry, when you do ministry, who you're trying to reach and serve in your ministry, and so forth and so on, to answer all the key W's and the H. We're going to look today at the discovery, and the foundation of your ministry design is that of core values. If you get today's information, if you discover it, identify them incorrectly, there are consequences, because you're going to build as the foundation of your ministry design. You're going to build your mission and your vision and your ministry plan on your core values. As we have stated in earlier webinar, that core values are defined as drivers. Matter of fact, I'll just give you a couple of examples that you can find and tuck away. First, I define it as the enduring, underlying, often unstated motivation that really drives a church in 3 things: its attitudes, its actions, and its interpersonal relationships. They are a set of priorities that govern everything that happens in our ministries. Dawn Barkley and her husband are on staff at a church in Durham, North Carolina. She wrote an article for Leadership Journal. In it, she says, our core values are our internal navigation system. They guide us and lead us. They are at the core of how we choose and what we decide, how we behave, how we act. They describe who we are. They are unspoken rules and regulations, terms and conditions by which we live. Core values are those enduring things that a congregation holds deeply and dearly. They're at the heart and core of a church's identity, and yet we don't talk about them very much. These values strongly influence every decision that is made, every action that is taken, and every dollar that is spent by our churches. Core values remain fixed in a congregation while everything around them may be in constant state of change. If they are removed, the people would feel as if they were no longer the same church. At the core of who you are, at the center of who you are a set of values, 3 to 7 values, that are dictating why you think the way you do, why you do the things you do, why you spend your money, why you build the buildings, why you develop the programs, why you have special events, why you focus in one area and not another with your ministry. At the foundation of it, and if you're going to discover these as we go through discovering your core values today, you need to understand what values are. Again, values are your church's guiding principles. They don't change very easily. You don't add them very easily. They tell you who you are as a church throughout the life of your church. No matter what your strategies, your circumstances, or your environment, they are there. Core values reveal the historical and current positive elements of your church's personality. They tell your story. They identify what is unique about you. They discern what is important to you. And so we have talked about the distinctions and the dominance, the power, the importance of core values. Today we're going to look at the discovery and the discernment of core values. And then we'll talk about the development and the delivery of your core values. Let me say several things to you. Aubrey Malphurs, who is a professor in the seminary at Dallas Theological, he's written numerous very helpful books, and he wrote one entitled Values-Driven Leadership. In his book, he discusses a number of techniques or methods for discovering your core values. Let me just review these with you, and you can jot them down as we go. You can always refer to his book. But number one, he says you can write out your values, define them, provide examples, make an exhaustive list, and then prioritize them. He calls it the cold turkey approach, and he doesn't recommend it. He also is a ministry coach like I am. But you're just asking people to write it out. The next technique he shares with us, he says take a values audit. And Appendix D of his book is an audit for churches. And you can take it as an individual or take it as a church. Each person is to identify their actual, not their aspirational, values from the list in the exercise. Each person may add values not on the list. So you don't have to go by his list, but you're to rate them 1 to 5. 5 being the strongest feeling that you have about a certain issue or value that has the most importance to you, and 1 for the weakest. And then you reorganize the selected values in the highest to the lowest in your priorities. The second technique he says you can use is to study the value system of other churches. With this one, you work through a list of examples, you examine which ones resonate with you, you determine which ones you'll hold to, which ones attract your attention, and often we can identify some of these because they'll jump off the page with you. These 3 things fold into the 4th one, and that is to describe the ideal church. So you describe what the ideal church would look to you in its services, in its staff, its congregation, its community, the style of church, your administration, your organization, your preaching, teaching, and communication. You break it down and decide and say what's the ideal church going to look like. In the same book, he recommends several ways for the church to discover it, along with the individual discovering it. But he goes on to say you can do storybooking. And storybooking, a session that he uses as a coach, combines the audit where you look and choose from 15 or 20 or 30 choices. It is a brainstorming session where you just jot down what you think are your core values, and then a critical thinking process. And you ask the individuals who were there, your church leaders, to select the key values based on the audit, each person's response on an index card, and pin it to a board, a storyboard, where everyone can see it. Then you narrow down the list, and you continue narrowing down the list until you've got it down to 3 to 6 key core values that you believe are at the very essence of who you are. These 4 or 5 ways that he goes through are helpful and can be a part of the process. But he warns that the problem is that we have a tendency to run to our aspired, ones that we know we should have because they're biblical, instead of identifying our actual. And so, excuse me again, this process, this task, this duty of identifying your ministry's core values is not an easy project, and it's not often approached. It's not often dealt with. Guys would rather start with vision or maybe have to go back to their mission. But as I said in the start of this webinar, at the front end, at the foundation of everything you build, there needs to be an identification. In the webinar on dominance, I explained why. Because if your core values do not match up, the ones that you say you have are not your actual ones, you're in trouble. So let's go through a 4-step process for discovering your core values. And you can blend any of the other 4 or 5 that we just mentioned in their techniques with audits and looking at lists and writing them down and brainstorming and working as a group to put them on a board and really think through and talk through them and narrow them down. All of those are useful techniques for you to use as you lead your church through the discovery process. But Pastor, at the front end of this, there is some examination that you're going to have to do as the leader, that you're going to have to take care of this, because values have an enormous impact on the health and effectiveness of our congregation, whether we identify them correctly or not. So, what are some things that you can examine? And by examine, I mean inspect, analyze, critique, scrutinize, investigate, inquire, sift, vet, explore, audit, take stock, take inventory, search, review, concentrate on, research, test, hold up to the light and examine it. Experiment, check, question, observe. You're going to examine means you're going to drill down into the following areas so that you can begin to identify, like a private investigator, like a scientist. And you want to identify through examination and discover the core values that rest in your congregation, both individuals and as a group or groups. And so you can look at your congregation. You can look at their DNA and their genetic code. Look at their heritage. Where did they come from? Where did the church start from? Did the church come from a church split down the road? Did it come because they got angry at some of the actions or thinking or core values or direction or focus of another church, and so they left? Or was the church started because they felt like they had a ministry together? And you need to look at the heritage and the origin of their DNA. By their DNA, I'm talking about their ethos. An ethos is a summary statement of our true guiding beliefs, the characteristics and attitudes and habits. They are typical, they are distinctive, and they're a distinguishing trait or quality about the church. At our essence, at the very center of our nature, there are distinctive qualities, characteristics of attitudes and habits, the very heart of who we are as a church. That's the genetic code, the DNA. It's what fleshes out how we act and do. It is our shape as a ministry, our spiritual gifts, our heart, our passions, our abilities, our personalities, and our experiences as a church. You want to look at your congregation and examine the heart of who they are. To give some explanation of this, a pastor that I know had been in his church for a decade or more, and they had a special day for him. And in it, the individuals in his congregation began to define him and describe him, to give his essence. And they were showing appreciation for his ministry to the church family. But over and over and over again, for this one friend of mine, came back the essence of who he was, his ethos, was one word: compassion. And it rang throughout the written notes, the pastor told me, and the testimonies they gave, both from the church and the community, that the guy was known as, in his very nature, his very center of who he is, he was a man of compassion. So when your congregation and you and your leaders and the community look at your congregation and they peel away the onion, to get to the center of what's there, what are you going to find? You can look at your congregation and need to understand that who we really are as a congregation will bleed to the surface of our life and our living. But you can examine, and over time, it may take you, and I'm telling you to do this ahead of going to all your other leaders. I want you to go and do this and spend time praying and investigating and examining who these people are. Who are you as a leader, your leadership staff, your lay leadership, however you're organized and set up as a congregation, to thoroughly examine them, because often a church family will put a wishful ethos statement in their ads. In other words, Eastside Church, the friendly church; Westside Church, the caring place; Central Church, a place for families. And then you get on the inside of it, and it was just a branding or marketing tool. They wanted to tell the community who they were, but if the two don't match up, people get there and they have an expectation of finding Eastside Church as a friendly church, or Westside Church as a caring church, or Central Church as a focus or a place for families. And if you aren't those things, you have mismarketed yourself, miscommunicated. You have misrepresented who you are. You ought to be able to look at your congregation and peel back the onion of who they say they are, and what they say they're to be doing, and who they say they're to be serving, and really boil it down and uncover to find out what is there. What you'll find in congregations are really examples of an ungodly ethos. Angie Ward wrote about it in Leadership Journal. Gives the example of two churches that her and her husband have worked in, and she wrote the article as a pastor's wife, and probably as a staff member. And she said that one church they worked in, the ethos of that church, while it talked about outreach, winning souls and making disciples and honoring God and having good biblical values, really their ethos statement really was, don't rock the boat. They didn't want to offend anybody. They didn't want to take any risk. They didn't want to deal with hidden sin. The church, could find wrong with anything. Others would have a true ethos would be, visitors are welcome. They can come back if they really want to. We're saved by grace, but we live under the law. Instead of having an ethos that really communicates what would be godly, biblical values. So you can look at your congregation to see if what they say are actually their values, are lived out by their actions. So do they walk the talk? The second thing that you can do is look at your congregation's actions, then look at their culture. The culture is a shared attitudes, values, and beliefs that will define a church and shape its practices. Your culture can be encapsulated into your ethos. Culture should reflect your mission statement. Your ethos should flow out of your mission and purpose. If it doesn't, it can subvert God's vision for your ministry. This is why it's so important to have a heart that is in tune with God and lines up with His values. Failure to do so can cripple your efforts to serve Him and carry out your ministry. So you want to make certain that you look at a church's conduct to determine if it does what it says it's going to do. Its culture and its conduct should be blended together. So how well do you know the code of your church, the genetic code, the DNA code? How well do you understand the core, the innermost being at the heart of your ministry there? The people. And then you look at their conduct over history. You might look at their current activities. The way they behave will reflect what we really believe is important, what we value. So look at their attendance. Are there activities, events, or ministries that they attend more and come out for that really tells you what they believe is important? What do they emphasize? Here's another one. What are they enthusiastic about? Let me go back to their attendance and their emphasis and their involvement and their enthusiasm by talking about the involvement. There was a study done last year by Leadership Network, and they wrote a book from their research and two larger bodies of research on church involvement, membership involvement in the ministries of the church. What they found is that the average church in North America, the average congregation, only 20% of them are actively involved in ministry in the church. To begin declaring yourself healthy as a church, that number should be closer to 45%. And if you really want to be effective and set the goal high in our churches in North America, you're going to set a goal of 65% of your membership being actively involved in serving in at least one of the ministries in your church. And I take this from being unhealthy to 45% being healthy. So 20% unhealthy, 20% down. As you get closer to 45% of your membership being involved in your ministries there, you're healthy. And as you get closer to 65, now you're really can consider yourself fit. So fit being in shape, not just free from disease, being healthy. So as you look at your congregation, you want to judge their commitment by their actions, not what they say. Oh, Pastor, I love the Lord. I want to serve him. You want to look at how they live out their life. What causes do they support by their giving of their time, talent, and treasure? Put their money where their mouth is. Do they talk the talk or just do they walk the talk? Our actions need to line up with our stated priorities, our core values. And so, does your ethos of your congregation and your conduct match your mission statement? In other words, for you to say, our mission is to carry out the Great Commission in this way. And that's the way that you believe God would flesh himself out through you to carry out that that calling which God has given to you. If your conduct betrays your calling and they don't match up, you got yourself a problem. Now, let me talk about accountability while we as leaders go through and carry out this first step when we examine the conduct of our church. When you measure your actions against your declarations, do they match up? Does your calling, your cause, your purpose, your mission as a church match up to the way you live? Do your church's actions and conduct, how they spend their time, talent, and treasures, equal or match up to your calling? And so you inspect what you expect. If you say you love God and souls, then there should be evidence of that in your lives. Preaching it is one thing, doing it is entirely another. Here's another area that you want to examine, and that's the cash. It's been said for years, if you want to know what a family really values, get a hold of their checkbook. Get a hold of their bank statement online now. And so you want to see if the allotment and the allowances, that the way they have broken down their budget, how they have budgeted their general funds, their operating budget, and you look at what is under the category of outreach and discipleship, and you can begin to tell what they value the most by where they spend the money. What items are listed in the budget and what part or slice of the pie is allocated or given as an allowance or designated to that particular ministry. Then you look at the investment. The investment, you compare expenditures. How did they spend their money? Both general funds and designated funds. What did people give toward outside of the general fund? It will tell you a lot about what they believe is important, because people put their time, talent, and treasure into those things that they believe are important. Then the next area you look at is your cores, your staff, your paid staff, and your lay staff as well. You look at your leaders and your staff, and you look at their personalities, how they're shaped, their practice, and your players, both official and unofficial, in your church, as to who's leading, who's making the decisions, who's really making the calls, who is the one that's in charge. Then you want to look at not only who the leaders are and who's in charge, both officially and unofficially, and how they go about leading, what their interests are, what their core values and priorities are, where do they spend their time, talent, and treasure, what's their actions, what's their essence and ethos, what's at the heart and core of your leaders in your church, yourself and your paid staff and your volunteer leaders. Then you look at areas where you gave them jobs to do, the areas of ministry. What areas of ministry, people or groups or services did you assign your staff to? So when you begin to look at this and you begin to weigh what percentage of your focus is internal and what percentage of your focus is external, how are they blended together? Are you, as you balance, look at the balance of those two, do you find that your cash and your staff, your cores, your leaders, the crew of people you put together, that their focus is all about the church membership and not about the community and reaching them, and it's unbalanced, then it tells you where the values are. It tells you who their focus is. When we're told to reach people with the gospel, that has to be lived out. And you can just go as far as how your manpower and your money is used to begin identifying and examining and identifying what the true, real-life reality is about what's important to your church. So, when you look at the focus and the duties of your staff, what do you find? Here's another area: the company, the crowd, the company that people keep, the target group. Who do they favor? Who do they spend their time? Who gets the lion's share of your attention and assets? Not only you, but it can be you. If you find yourself always eating with believers, always doing activities with believers, always going with believers, you say, well, I'm pastoring a church. They're believers. And you don't have any kind of intertwining of your fabric, your being, with unchurched, de-churched, unsaved, lost people, that tells you something about your value system. And so who gets the lion's share of your attention and assets? Who do you hang with the most? Be mindful that the value system of your community can seep into your congregation. You see, your church should be made up of the people in the congregation. So are you willing to risk having lost people come into your church and to be there and to go on a journey of coming to Christ? Are you afraid of what values they're going to bring in and the focus they're going to bring in, that it somehow is going to contaminate your church family and your culture? I say that because sometimes if a community is just very closed and cloistered, isolated in itself, and it doesn't accept new people easily, those people come to Christ and come to church. Those values are still there, and they may not want to reach out into the community because it's not a part of their DNA. And you've got to deal with it as a leader. And we'll give you a process of how to deal with core values that are ungodly, unbiblical, that you know need to be replaced with godly ones. You know, what do? You know, you might ask your community, those in your community, for their perception of your congregation and ministry. Go ask somebody else. They may be able to identify right away by saying, hey, you say you're this, but we don't see you doing it, and give you an honest response. Be sure to ask God for his wisdom in estimating the true values of your congregation. Ask him to reveal who you are, to bring light, his light, on your values, so you can correctly identify how God sees you and what they really are. Here's another area: communication. What is the congregation and yourself and your staff, what do you talk about most? What topics are most on their minds? What topics are taboo? What are they not talking about? What do they feel is most important? When you look at these things, You can examine your congregation, your conduct, your cash, your core, your company, and your communication. But let me give you some sample questions to help you identify your core values. And I'll just run down through these, and then I'll make the list available to you as a part of the webinar. You can download it off our website. Here they are to help you identify your core values. Where are you sending conflicting messages about your values? Does your mission statement line up with your core values? What is the evidence that your congregation passionately holds to any particular value that you claim as an actual value, not an aspirational value, but an actual value? You see, we prove our values by what we plan, fund, implement, and evaluate. You can't measure something that doesn't exist. So here's a question for you. If you were to start a new church, would this core value that you say you have be a part of its foundation? Will you continue to hold the values that you have no matter what happens in the future? Are you willing to stand by any of your values no matter what the cost? Do you believe members and staff of your church should continue to be part of your church if they don't agree with your discovered values? That's a tough question. I mean, what about your deacons, your elders, your stewards, your key leaders, your board? What about your Bible teachers in your church and your counselors and your outreach staff, and on and on and on you go, your children's ministry director and workers? Is your staff exhibiting your core values in their leadership? Will you close your church before giving up your core values? Do you apply your core values in your private life? If you could do anything in the world, would you continue to apply your core values to your ministry activities, or would you want to use some different ones? What gets the most attention in your church? What programs and initiatives get the best response? Which ones get the weakest response? People don't attend to them, don't want to fund them, don't want to work in them. What gets the most money? What will get you into trouble if you do something or don't do something? Or you just mess up? What gets pulpit time? Your announcement time? What gets the most energy and resources? What gets measured? What do people get the most excited about? What are people willing to stand and be counted for? What are the deepest convictions? What is accepted and what is rejected in your church? What is the most urgent? What causes them to stand up, leave their seat, and go want to get involved, or to come forward and sign up for a ministry? What values will your congregation and leaders adhere to under stress and opposition? Which of your stated values would cripple your ministry if you removed it? What are the particular characteristics and ministries you feel God has called your church to exhibit and embrace? Among the many things you can do as a church, where will you center your energy, passion, and resources? Let's move to the second step, and that's step 2, evaluation. You're going to evaluate, and here are your duties. You're going to appraise and assess and estimate the things that you have examined. You're going to evaluate them. You're going to place worth on them. You're going to judge the worth or accuracy of what you've investigated and the findings, what you've examined, what's come to the surface. As you've peeled the layers of the onion back, layers of your church back, and looked at the very heart and reality as to what's most important to your church, now you've got to evaluate what you found. You've got to judge the worth and determine the value of it. You've got to decide as a leader and determine and to then declare these are your duties. So, what are you looking for? What are you looking for? When you go to evaluate what you think are the top 10 or 12 core values, and maybe you've been able to narrow it down to 3 to 7, what are you looking for? Well, you're looking for the actual core values versus those you aspire to. You're trying to match up what is actual by telling what their actions are. Because what you think is important is where you're going to give your time, talent, and treasures. The Bible teaches us that where your heart is, there will your treasures be also. They are connected together. And so when you go to evaluate them, to give that appraisal and assessment and estimation so that you are going to judge and decide and determine what are your true, honest to goodness, real core values. You're looking for the actual ones, not fake ones. So what is required of us when we start really doing this as leaders? What's required of us to correctly evaluate where our congregation is? What if we find something we don't like? What if we're pastoring a church and leading a church where the values are not biblical, they're not godly, they're selfish, they're sinful, they're not priorities, they're not God's best, they're not what he intended. It's not the Great Commission carried out in the spirit of the Great Commandment. So what's required of us as we evaluate this is we're going to give a true estimate of what we find, the actual values, the key priorities that drive our ministry at the very center of who we are. What's required of us? First off is integrity, honesty, and being honorable. You're going to have to be honest and honorable. You're going to have to be transparent. You're going to have to be courageous. You're going to ask God to give you courage to correctly evaluate what you see as you investigate and examine and inspect your congregation. You're looking at their lives, the way they live it out at home and at church and at work and in the community and at play and so forth. It takes courage. It takes discrimination. You have got to be discriminate about it, but you've also got to be one who judges. And so your true character is going to come out as you begin to evaluate this. Now let's look at step 3. You're going to exegete the core values. What do I mean by that? Well, here are your duties. Someone's got to interpret what you found and evaluated. Someone's got to translate it so people can understand it. Someone's got to explain what is there. Someone has got to interpret the ethos of your congregation. They've got to translate, explain, and interpret it. Then they're going to serve as a guide and a director and a navigator so that you can lead your congregation through the discovery phase, because everything else you're doing is built on the integrity and the accuracy of your identifying, discovering, and developing your genuine core values. You may be brought face to face with things that you don't like or that you wish were different, or you don't know how to reconcile what you're called to do in Scripture as a church and what your genuine core values are. And so as you look at this, there is a process. In the process, you're going to eliminate most of the options as you take audits. You're going to eliminate most of what you see, and you're going to elect a few. So you've got to funnel down or sift to vet all the different things that could be priorities in the top 3 to 7 core things that could serve as core values that is driving your church to action, your attitudes and your actions, that creates an atmosphere or a culture about your church. You're going to have to boil it down. And you as the leader are going to have to go through this process of eliminating most of the possibilities and electing a few. And then you're going to have to characterize and describe them. You're going to have to classify and catalog them. You're going to have to prioritize them. You're going to have to then communicate them. You've got to be able to do these things with the understanding that when you go through this, reason why I tell you need to ask God to give you courage and integrity and transparency, to take an honest, honorable look at how you are as a congregation, from the senior pastor to his staff and support staff, to the lay leaders, to your ministry directors and your volunteer workers, to your congregation as a whole. You have to understand you may run against a possible problem that may pop up. What if you find that you've got a charade going on in your congregation? This is a pretense that is fiction. You say you're tough, but you're really not. You say you're loving, but you really aren't. You say that you care, but you really don't. You say that you want to be Christ-like, but you don't make any effort. You say that you're Savior-centered, Christ-centered, but really you're selfish and self-serving. What happens if you say that you value one thing while your behavior reveals another? When you actually sit down and you look at the attitudes and the actions and the atmosphere of your church, and you really come to grips with the fact that we're saying one thing, we have a pretense, we've got a charade here. We're saying one thing and it's really fictitious. That is not who we really are. What if you discover a facade? A facade is an imposing appearance that is concealing something inferior. I'll give an old example, but have you ever watched The Wizard of Oz at the end of it with the little man standing behind the curtain? He was giving the pretense or the appearance of being big and dangerous and forceful and capable and breathing down their necks, and really behind it was something completely different. And so a facade is an imposing appearance that conceals something that is much less inferior. It's much more inferior. A genuine core value does more than stir our emotions. It stirs our actions. And if you dig into this and find out that your congregation has put up a facade and a charade, the Apostle Peter deals with it in Scripture and talks about a mask on a stick, that players in their plays presented themselves as being one character and having certain characteristics, and it was all a facade. It was fake. You didn't see anything. One of my friends designed and built phase 1 of this building on new land, and he couldn't afford to build the worship center, the auditorium, his sanctuary, in the first phase, and so they created a wraparound facade. And when people drove up, they would walk in that door and be in a hallway, a foyer, but the doors leading from the foyer into the auditorium was just a big hole, just a big empty space. And it wasn't until some years later that one of the national builders, church builders I worked with, that we built their auditorium. Well, it was a facade. It gave the appearance of having something when it was empty. There was nothing there. They didn't meet in that empty space. It went to nowhere. And so if your church is a cloud with no rain, what are you going to do about that? How do we deal with this? How do we lead change in the culture and character of our congregation so it matches biblical and godly values? What are you going to do when the driving force at the heart of your church is not godly? It's not a biblical mandate. What they say is their calling, what you preach from the pulpit is not actually being carried out. What are you going to do about that? Well, I'm going to give you some just initial steps here. How do you cultivate and lead change in an atmosphere and actions and attitudes don't match up to biblical values? Number one, you better pray for change of hearts. You better pray for the saints. You better start praying, earnestly praying as a pastor for your congregation. Secondly, you're going to confront the sin. The heart is deceitfully wicked. It tells itself it's fine and acceptable, like it is. And then you're going to have to confront the sin. You see, changing your creed, your core values, your value statement, your core value statement, without changing your character, your heart's desire, being in tune with God's, it's useless. It's futile. It's not going to make you able to carry out your mission and fulfill your vision. Your foundation is faulty. It's crumbling. It's not based on the rock. It's based on the sand. So what are you going to do about it? Number one, you need to pray. You need to go to God to ask for wisdom. You need to pray that God will give you direction as a leader, and then you need to start praying for God to work in the hearts at the very core of people's spiritual lives, of who they are and their desires. To see Psalm 37, verse 4, delight thyself also in the Lord, and he'll give you the desires of your heart. To see them choose Matthew 16:24, if any man would come after me, let him deny himself, die to himself, deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. It's a changing of priorities, of values, where you exchange your selfish ones, your self-centered values, for the values of the Savior, for Christ. Christ-centered living makes what he values preeminent. Give it prominent place in your time, talent, and treasure, and how you live. It affects your attitude, your actions, and the atmosphere of your church, the culture of your church. So you're going to pray for the saints. Number two, confront the sin. You want to make certain that you line up. So there's alignment, congruence, and agreement. So you're not a living contradiction. So that when people hear the branding that you put out in the community, and visitors, guests come to your church and stay for 3 or 4 weeks and attend some activities and go to a couple Bible studies, and they begin to peel back the onion to really determine who you are, and you're a living contradiction, you're saying one thing out to the community and actually living a total different way internally, you could have misunderstood what your core values are, and that's what your branding misrepresents. But it also could be where you're saying you have godly intents, desires, core values, but you really don't. So if you deal with this, you've got to, number 3, you've got to cultivate the soil of your church, the souls there, to develop godly values. There's going to be the replacement principle from the New Testament put into place here in Paul's writing, that they replace the old with that which is godly and new. Philippians 4:8, think on these things, and he lists things that we are to think on. So their thinking has to change, so their attitudes can change, and their actions will follow, and your culture will change by the actions being carried out. This is not an easy thing, and many a church splits or dies over the need to adjust and adapt the culture. But God called you to shepherd and care for the church. And if you hope to have the eternal impact that God tells you you can have in his word, and you're going to partner with him in what he is doing, then you've got to exchange your desires for his. Here's the last step. Step 4 is to embrace godly core values, biblical core values. Make them yours and live them out. Build your ministry on them. So what happens if you fail to carry out these 4 steps, to identify and articulate them correctly? What happens if you do that? First off, you're building on the pyramid I showed you. The foundation is core values. Missions is resting on it and driven by your core values. Your desires determine where you're going to expend yourself, your mission, your calling, how you carry out or flesh out the Great Commission. It's done in different ways by different people in different places for different purposes of bringing people to Christ to make disciples. It means your planning's going to be poor. You're going to have low morale. You're going to have broken relationships. You're going to have weak decision-making paradigm. You're going to focus on trivial matters. Personal taste and traditions are going to rule your roost. You're looking at your church right now and you say, yep, that's us. What are you going to do? You'll kick the decision can down the road because you can't come to any agreement. You can't make decisions in unity with harmony, in unison, in agreement, if your values, what you feel are the most important things. I can remember sitting over 20 years ago with my leaders at our church wanting to use some new technology that I thought would help both the church and the community. And our value systems were far enough apart that they just could not agree to the technology. They weren't about to use it. Excuse me. And we couldn't use it because we couldn't come to agreement. We kicked that decision can down the road. You've got to look at this at the price of failure to correctly discover your core values is you're not going to be able to plan right. Your morale is going to sag. Relationships are going to stay broken or get broken. Your decision-making paradigm is broken. You're going to focus on trivial stuff and personal taste and preference and traditions, which you've formerly done. We've always done it this way. It's going to be the mantra for your church. It's going to rule. And you're going to just keep kicking this thing down the road. So as you do this, what will embracing your core values do for you in your ministry? How is it going to reward you? What reward is there if you do this correctly? Even if you find things that aren't right, and then you have to take a period of time to go through those steps of praying and confronting and cultivating, then what are you going to get as a reward? It's going to produce a higher morale in your church. It's going to produce proper planning. It's going to enable conflict resolution. It's going to develop healthier relationships. People get along. People get along because they believe the same things are important. I mean, you ever watched a ball game where you felt it was very important one team win, and sitting next to you was somebody else who felt it was very important that the other team win, or that it was important that your team lose? How healthy would that relationship be? You've got different value systems. It'll help you focus on God and His will. You'll be able to work in unison together. It develops a decision-making framework so that not only you at the top, but the people in the middle and the bottom of your organizational chart know what's valuable and what the priorities are for your ministry, and it gives them a framework for making decisions on the spot, as well as planning for their individual ministries in your church. It allows for stronger new member orientation. We dealt with this in the definition and the dominance, the importance of knowing your core values. If people don't fit because their core values are too far apart from your churches, they'll know it's not the place for them. And so if you want to have a strong new member orientation, identify, discover, and develop, and then communicate your core values so that everybody knows what you value. I hope this has been helpful to you. I'm Marshall Shannon, your Ministry Design Coach with Ministry Design Training and Ministry Design Concepts. You can reach me here at Marshall and our office number and our cell phone number. I trust the Lord's blessing upon you as you go through the very difficult task of discovering your core values so that you can build your ministry and your game plan on solid rock and being in total agreement with the values that you ought to have and the ones that you do have, so that you can partner with God and see Him work in a great and mighty way. This is Marshall Shannon with Ministry Design Concepts.